Okay, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Lord God, let us inspire thy faithful by the light of thy Holy Spirit. Grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and evermore rejoice in his holy consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady of the Christians, Saint Thomas Aquinas, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Thank you all for submitting your midterms. I do not have them for you, alas, but I will have them for you, hopefully, if not next week, then in the near future. So you will all receive them back. If anyone has not yet turned in their midterms to me, I don't think that's true, but if you haven't, you have chosen to live dangerous. I hope that isn't the case. Okay. Now, are there any questions before I launch?
When will you assign the final?
I will assign the final, I think it's on the syllabus when I will assign it, but if it is
November 2nd.
November 2nd, okay, which means next week.
More important question,
Yes.
how long will we have?
Oodles of time, you'll have 2 weeks.
Oh.
So
Is it
from-
possible, just real quick, sorry, is it possible to have an extension, because we have 2 classes, 2 weeks in a row where we have 3 classes, and we have 4 classes in 1 week?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So,
Okay, thank you.
I mean, we can negotiate that. In fact, why don't I just give you your final exam instead of on the 2nd? Our class goes for, we have 3 more, right? 1, 2, no, 2.
This one and one more.
This one and one more. This one and one more.
Next week.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, let's see. So I will give you the final exam next week, and then I will give you 3 weeks.
That would be much better.
Is that better?
That would be amazing.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Does this qualify as murmuring?
Yes, I was trying to do it without murmuring.
Enunciate. It's not murmuring, it's enunciate.
Are we already on class 7? Okay, well,
So that's true. If we could just find 20 days.
okay. And on that note. All right, so we are going to discuss today living the moral life. We're going to do an introduction to moral theology. Now I'm panicking a little bit because I looked at the syllabus. That is what you have for today, is it not? Or did I read the syllabus wrong?
I think you didn't finish the 4 marks.
Introduction to sacramental theology. Sacramental grace.
Did I read
I
the
think-
syllabus wrong?
I think it was last week, but
Yes, last week was introduction to moral.
Yes, we're behind.
yeah.
So don't worry. Yes, okay, that's why I did that, right, okay. So we are 1 class behind, which means I'm going to have to figure out a way to give you sacraments and Catholic social doctrine and Mariology and eschatology and grace and the liturgy, and it's not gonna happen. So whatever I finish giving you, that is all you will be required to know about, okay? And I apologize for not getting through it all, such as that. So today we are a week behind, effectively, but we need to cover this material because, after all, living the moral life is very important. So tonight we're going to look in as much detail as possible at why the Catholic Church's vision of morality is both liberating and life-giving, which is a message we do not often hear in our culture. In fact, especially since the sexual revolution of the 1960s, I would argue that the exact opposite is heard almost from the rooftops. We hear loud and impassioned calls for freedom. Freedom to do what we want, when we want, how we want, with whom we want to do it, as long as, and I quote, it doesn't hurt anyone. And we actually all know the anthem that goes along with this vision. Imagine there's no heaven, right? It's easy if you try, right? In that view, the Catholic Church is held to be the oppressor in chief, a backwards and ultimately medieval institution whose goal must be to keep people miserable. As the modern poet Daniel Albert Gotti put it, by making fun of the prologue of the Gospel of John, many people view Catholic morality today in stark and entirely unappealing terms. And I quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no." But is the Catholic Church's vision of morality a discussion ending? No, don't do this, don't do that, don't. Is the Catholic Church interested in making people unhappy and in limiting their freedom? Does the Catholic Church want a bunch of downtrodden and morose slaves who merely pay, pray, and obey? Or does she proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, which liberates us in season and out of season, and calls us to be God's beloved who grow into the freedom of God's children? Romans 8:21. I've been giving you this lecture before, haven't I? Okay. Okay. All of a sudden, my brain, I was looking at it, I thought, have I done this before? Yeah, deja vu. Your previous diaconal habits have come back to haunt me. All right, we're not nearly fast. Oh my goodness. All right. So in this lecture, it's my goal to give you a defense of Catholic teaching on morality, virtue, and authentic freedom, not only so that you can teach this yourselves, but so that you yourselves can hear this gospel anew, and that hearing it anew, you might fall more deeply in love with the God whose grace liberates us and whose power rescues us from slavery to sin. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, St. Paul once wrote to the faithful of the early church in Galatia, "For freedom Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery." Galatians 5:11. So let's look together at how that's true and how we too can be set free from our slavery and become truly happy and free in Jesus Christ. Those terms, happy, free, Jesus, that is the structure often of Catholic moral reflection, okay? Jesus makes us happy and free, right? That's Catholic moral theology in a nutshell, right? Now, obviously, there's a lot more to say about it than that, okay? So this is, like everything we've done in this course, skimming the surface of a very, very deep ocean, right? And only skimming the surface, because that's all we can.
Father, could we say Jesus makes us free, therefore we're happy?
And we can. And you are about to enter into that more deeply in this lecture. So I will press pause and come back to you later. Because you're spot on, okay? So my presentation is going to follow Aquinas' plan, right, in his theology of morality. And in addition, I'm going to have as a conversation partner one of Aquinas' greatest modern interpreters in the field of moral theology. So if you want to go deeper into that ocean that I described, right, use this guy. So I'm going to make use of 4 works of the Belgian Dominican father who has gone to God, Survey Guitars, from 4 of his books on this topic. Those 4 books are Passions and Virtue, Morality, the Catholic View, The Pursuit of Happiness, God's Way, and Sources of Christian Ethics. And I would highly recommend, in particular, the last of these, sources of Christian ethics. If you want a work to refer to, hint, hint, for the final, hint, hint, sources of Christian ethics, everyone should buy this book, okay? You're not obligated to do so, okay, but if you want to understand Catholic moral theology better, sources of Christian ethics by Surveying Affairs or Cars is the way to go. And so to the structure of our discussion, which is in fact the structure of Aquinas' own moral theology. In the first main section of tonight's lecture, I'm going to discuss 1, happiness and the ultimate end of the human person. 2, the passions, and 3, virtue and vice. So first, happiness and the ultimate end of the human person. Second, the passions, and third, virtue and vice. And then in the second half of this lecture, we're going to finish Aquinas' presentation of the moral life by talking about 1, the significance of the law of the Old and New Testaments for the moral life, 2, the importance of grace, and 3, the meaning and development of authentic freedom. I'm going to come back to that, so don't think that you need to write for it. Okay. So part 1, happiness, the passions, and virtue and vice. First, let's talk about happiness. As you've seen already in this class, one of Aquinas' principal contributions to the development of Catholic thought, which has had an enormous effect on Catholic philosophy and theology since his time, is that he baptized the work of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, right? What that means is that Aquinas brought the truth that he found in Aristotelian philosophy into contact with the gospel. And as Aquinas himself puts it, and as we've already discussed, by reading Aristotle in light of the gospel, he, quote, changed the water of philosophy into the wine of revelation. Changed the water of philosophy into the wine of revelation. That's actually a more filled out quote. He just says he changed the water into wine. Okay. And if you want a reference from that, for that, it's from Aquinas' commentary on Boethius' De Trinitate, question 2, article 3, response to objection 5. Okay. Don't need to know that, but just one. And we can see this in a particular way in Aquinas' Aristotelian understanding of happiness, which in Latin is called beatitudo. Happiness is beatitudo. And since it is that, think of the word, right? Beatitudo, what does that sound like? Exactly. Okay. For Aquinas and Aristotle, happiness is our final end. In Greek, it is our telos, the ultimate goal we seek, which lies at the root of all of our actions. As Aristotle and Aquinas both notice, in order for us to be able to do anything, in order to bring our will, that is our voluntary faculty from potency into act, we need to have an end, a goal for which we act. We have discussed this, but just remember, right? What would it mean not to have goals? It would mean that you wouldn't even get up in the morning, right? Because if you don't have a goal for which you act, right, then you can't reduce your will to act, right? Okay. And one of these goals is supreme. Goal with a capital G and the governor of all of our small g goals. Aristotle and Aquinas say that this ultimate goal, this final end we seek, is happiness. Right? Every human being longs to be happy. And as Father Cares writes, and I quote, morality is a search for happiness. And of course, this is so obvious that we don't really even need to say it. But as the 4th century bishop of Hippo and doctor of the church, St. Augustine puts it succinctly, there is no doubt about it. We all want to be happy. Everyone will agree with me before the words are even out of my mouth. So let us see if we can find the best way to achieve it. That's Augustine. And of course, this is true of the good and the bad alike. Even those seriously wounded souls who commit heinous crimes do so under the governing inspiration of a search for happiness, albeit obviously a misguided one. In the case of criminals, while their definition of happiness is flawed and their means to obtain it are poorly chosen, their bad decisions, the small g goals that they take to get there, are nonetheless done under a governing search for happiness, for the enduring, stable, and restful joy of their hearts. And of course, this doesn't just apply to criminals, but to all of us poor sinners too. So what is this happiness that inspires all of our actions and guides our lives? Why is it important for the moral life? Before I go on, I want to bring up two Greek words which I think are important one Greek word in addition to telos, and that is skopos. Okay, and so a telos is the end. A skopos is like the target, right? So you pick the skopos to hit the telos, right? And so you can think of the small g goals that you have in life, and we all have them. Even the most basic one, which is for me in the morning, where is the coffee pot? You have to go to the machine, right? Now, that is, however, right, just a target that aims at the end, consciousness, right? For me, okay? All right. Now, Aquinas looks at the question of what human happiness, man's last end, consists in, and he proposes 8 false possibilities, which he draws from Aristotle before he comes down to his final answer. Let's look at these 8 possibilities together and see why they can't be our ultimate happiness. Now, this is lengthy and a bit complex, but it's very important for our understanding of the moral life and the church's moral theology. And I'm about to turn basically a Thomistic fire hose on. So just deep breath. That's okay. All right, very good. So the 8 possible contenders for happiness. Aquinas first asks, quote, whether happiness consists in wealth. Now, Aquinas says that there are in fact 2 types of wealth in this world, natural and artificial. By natural wealth, Aquinas means things like, and I quote, food, drink, clothing, cars, by which he means carriages, dwellings, and such like, which is to say things that, quote, serve man as a remedy for his natural wants. We might call these things the basic necessities of life, or creature comforts, to use modern expressions, right? Somewhere, I believe it's Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs or something like this. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. So,
the base level.
yeah, exactly. Right. So these are the basic necessities of life. On the other hand, by artificial wealth, Aquinas means those things that we can use to purchase the goods of natural wealth. What would that be? Money. Right. Exactly. Now, Aquinas says that the goods of natural wealth cannot be our ultimate happiness, because these things are, quote, sought for the sake of something else, which means that you seek the basic necessities of life. Why? Not because they are the ultimate goal, but rather because they assist you on your way towards your happiness. The goods of natural wealth help to make our search for happiness easier and more tolerable, but they are not in themselves our ultimate happiness. But in addition, of course, if that's the case, then the artificial wealth by which we purchase the goods of natural wealth can't be our happiness either, because we use artificial wealth as an instrument, right? It is purely an instrument to get the goods of natural wealth cannot be our ultimate happiness, even if natural goods assist us in our search for happiness. Obviously, if you have a magnificent home overlooking lagunas, lapping waves, right? And a Ferrari, right? You have more goods of natural wealth that may assist you. However, they also may get in the way of your ultimate happiness. In fact, very likely they will get in the way. All right, so natural wealth and artificial wealth cannot be our ultimate happiness, even if they are helpful aids potentially on our journey to happiness. Next, Aquinas asks whether man's happiness consists in honors. Now, people are honored, Aquinas notices, because of some excellent thing that they can do, some virtue they've acquired, or perhaps also because of the importance of the office that they hold, the job they do. So for instance, we honor Olympic divers because they can do backflips and twists and turns and then land with barely a splash and get them a medal, right? It's unbelievable that they can do that. We honor them. We also honor Nobel Peace Prize winners because of their virtuous deeds done on behalf of peace and justice. And we also give honor to certain individuals simply because of the office that they hold. For instance, we honor the President of the United States, whether or not we like the present incumbent, because of his or her office. That is to say, because he or she is the president, and not necessarily because he or she is good, right? So I'm not going to use any present examples, but if Andrew Jackson, right, who is long dead, right, but who did heinous things, right? I mean, the Trail of Tears, right? And Andrew Jackson is not a figure without some historical blemishes, right? Although we should judge him by modern standards. But if Andrew Jackson were to come back to life and walk through those doors, right? We should all, whether or not we like, stand, right? And we should be slightly, stunned, right? So the honors due to individuals because of their office reside in their office, right? And this is a bit of an aside, but it's just an important thing. This is why we use terms like, for a judge, your honor. Could be a very dishonorable individual, but he or she holds a job that is profoundly honorable, and we call the individual your honor because of the office. Similarly, we call bishops in America your excellency when addressing them. It sounds very strange to Americans, right? It has nothing to do with the individual as such. It has to do with the office he holds. Similarly, your holiness for the Pope, right? Whether or not the Pope, and I'm not talking about Francis, but whether or not a Pope is a good Pope or a bad Pope is irrelevant. The Pope holds an office, right? And that office is holy. So the title goes with the office, not with the man. It just happens to be associated with the man while he holds the office. Okay. Or if he had the office in the past. So for instance, you would still call an ex-president Mr. or Mrs. President by virtue of the fact that he or she held that office in the past. In America, that's not true in Australia. Ex-prime ministers cease to have the title, period. Okay, that was a big aside. All right. Now, Aquinas sees that while it could certainly be the case that the truly happy and virtuous person would and should receive honors on account of his or her virtue, authentic happiness cannot consist in the honors themselves. Otherwise, what? Well, the person wouldn't be authentically happy, but rather just a grasper after honors, which is actually pitiable and sad. It's kind of, oh man, this guy or lady just wants to be honored. That's sad, right? So Aquinas writes, and I quote, "But virtue's true reward is happiness itself, for which the virtuous work. Whereas if they worked for honor, it would no longer be a virtue, but an ambition." Thirdly, and similar to honors, Aquinas asks whether man's happiness consists in fame or glory. Now, I don't know about you, but I have, to my shame, read the tabloids. Okay, the stories of the stars and starlets. They are famous, there's no doubt. But do most of them look happy to you in any stable or enduring way? Nope. One of my favorite quotes in this regard, Steve Martin, great actor, great comedian, once said, and I quote, "If you want to be rich and famous, get rich first." In other words, fame isn't all it's cracked up to be, and given the choice between fame and riches, it's better to just be really, really wealthy. For Aquinas, following St. Ambrose, fame and glory, and I quote, consists in being well known and praised. But as Steve Martin suggests, fame and glory don't lead to happiness in the long run. And so, as Aquinas himself puts it, and I quote, "Fame has no stability. In fact, it is often easily ruined by false report. And if sometimes it endures, that is by accident. But happiness endures of itself and forever." End quote. So, fame and glory can't be the enduring and stable happiness that we see. What about the next thing? What about power? Does power make us ultimately happy? Once again, Aquinas says that the search for and possession of worldly power and authority cannot be our true happiness. And perhaps the easiest way to see why this is, Aquinas puts it this way. Power has relation to good and evil, whereas happiness is man's proper and perfect good and evil. So let's put that in other words. Since power can be used for good or evil, and happiness is never evil, then power cannot be our ultimate happiness. And in case anyone doubts this, and if you think that you might find enduring happiness in the possession and exercise of worldly power, just think of the powerful people in this world and ask yourselves if they've reached the goal and finality of human life in their possession of power. I can't imagine that any of us would think that this guy is particularly happy. Okay? He's not the most powerful man on earth, of course, but his life is consumed with power. And all I have to say is, no insult to Kim Jong-un. This is
I thought that was Aquinas.
But the haircut, can someone explain to me what this haircut is? And he always gets it, right? He's lost a lot of weight since this issue. But the haircut remains. That in itself tells you that power does not make you happy, right? He needs a new barber. Okay. So, yes, exactly, right. It's just, don't know how to explain it. Okay, next. Could happiness be any bodily good? And on this point, Aquinas' answer is based on what human beings are in comparison to other animals. Namely, like the animals, we are a composite unity of body and soul. I don't think we've discussed this very much in terms of human anthropology in this class, but it's an important thing to know. Human beings are a composite unity of body and soul, but so are praying mantises. Okay? So anything that exists in the created world has body and soul, the matter and what makes the matter to be what it is. So soul, right, in Aristotelian philosophy, which Aquinas adapts, is just the governing principle of what a thing is. What is it, right? And the matter, right? So you have what and material reality, they are intrinsically linked, right? They are a composite unity. So a rock is a composite unity of what rocks are and the stuff that rocks are, right? So what makes it to be what it is and the stuff that it is, right? And that's a bit, we typically talk about soul when we're talking about vegetative things. So Aristotle talks about vegetative souls as being the lowest level. So grass, for instance, right, has a vegetative soul combined with the matter that makes it what it is. Well, animals also have souls in this sense, right? Just the governing principle of what they are. So a lion is a composite unity of the stuff that the lion is made out of and what a lion is, okay? However, human beings, okay, are a composite unity of material body and rational spiritual soul. So our souls are not physical of their nature, they're not material, right? Whereas a lion is a composite unity of body and material soul. Its body and its soul cease to exist at the exact same time. Whereas our soul does not cease to exist after the death of the body because it's made to the image and likeness of God. Okay, so if we are not purely material, our ultimate happiness also cannot be purely material. It cannot, quote, consist in the goods of the body. So notice Aquinas says that while we surpass all the other animals in regards to happiness, at the same time, in bodily goods, we are surpassed by many animals. For instance, by the elephant in longevity, by the lion in strength, and by the stag in fleetness. End quote. And so what Aquinas is getting at here is that if our happiness were purely bodily, the lion would be far happier than we are, because the lion is far stronger than we are, right? And that is obviously not true, right? Because our capacities for happiness are far greater than the lion's due to our human nature, our composite unity of material body and rational spiritual soul. So happiness cannot be bodily, it must be spiritual. Now, if our happiness cannot be bodily or material, the next contender for happiness seems self-evidently impossible, and yet it still traps enormous numbers of people in its grasp. Namely, Aquinas asks, does happiness consist in pleasure? And you see, I have a case of celiac disease. I'm not supposed to eat gluten. So for me, this is like the stuff of dreams, okay? The Cinnabon, okay? If I knew that I were about to be hit by a truck, right? I would have an enormous cinnamon bun, okay? And a gigantic Paulaner Hefeweizen beer. And I would die. Okay. Now, we all know how serious of an issue the search for happiness in pleasure is today. It's blatantly obvious that we live in a hedonistic society. Throughout human history, men and women have sought their happiness through physical pleasures, be they sexual, alcoholic, narcotic, what have you. And this search for happiness through pleasure is not getting any better. To take but one example of this, the pornography industry makes billions of dollars enslaving men and women in a solitary and imaginary form of sexual pleasure, which I have read is more addictive than cocaine. Is that true?
That's
Psychologist?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
More addictive than cocaine, right? That's incredible. Now, if you ask an addict whether or not he or she is truly happy, if he or she is being honest and not blind to his or her own misery, the answer will be a resounding no. It's for this reason that Sexaholics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, etc. are so important and so successful. People desperately want freedom from their slavery to pleasure. They are not authentically happy, even when they give their bodies all of the various highs that their bodies crave. And so, once again, Aquinas is right, and his answer as to why pleasure cannot be found in, or rather why happiness cannot be found in pleasure, is based on a true understanding of human nature. Namely, goods of the body, even cinnabon in all of its splendor, okay, cannot be our ultimate happiness. When compared with goods of the soul, this simply pales. Well, that brings us to our next one. If bodily goods don't make the cut, what about goods of the soul? Are they enough to qualify for happiness? You may be surprised, but the answer is no. And so Aquinas proposes some good of the soul as the seventh false contender for happiness. Why? Simply because, and I quote, while happiness is something belonging to the soul, nonetheless, that which constitutes happiness is something outside of the soul. Now again, this gets philosophically dense pretty quickly, but it's worth thinking about, and I'll explain it as I go into it. The reason for this is that the soul is always potential with regard to that which brings it into act. It is not self-actualized nor self-created. We don't give ourselves being or existence, and as such, the soul and its goods cannot be our final end. Now, in the language of earth people, what does that mean? Okay, it means that there must be some reality outside of the soul, which is the soul's ultimate goal, its supreme happiness, which brings it from non-activity or potency into activity, from non-being into being. Remember, we human beings who are a composite unity of material body and rational spiritual soul cannot act at all unless we have an ultimate end that prompts us to act, which brings us from non-activity to activity. So our ultimate happiness has to be a spiritual good outside of us. So finally, Aquinas asks whether our happiness consists in any created good or in the uncreated good. And it's in dealing with this eighth and final false claimant that Aquinas finally reaches the identity of our true and ultimate happiness. First, Aquinas notes why created goods cannot be our ultimate end. And I quote, "It is impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness." And why? Because, he writes, happiness is the perfect good, the good that completely satisfies us, which is both the end of our intellectual search for truth and the summit of our voluntary search for goodness and love. Basically, once you reach your ultimate happiness, your final end and goal, you are completely satisfied spiritually. At the level of our souls, we rejoice. Our intellects are utterly fulfilled in their search for the truth, and our wills fall completely and irrevocably in love. Our final happiness, then, cannot be something that is created at all, because if so, I quote, "It would not be the last end if something yet remained to be desired." It would not be the last end if something yet remained to be desired. Basically, what Aquinas means here is quite simple. If you're still searching for happiness, you haven't found it yet, right? And you will not find it until you are completely and irrevocably happy. So, what is our true and ultimate happiness? And I'd like to read Aquinas' answer in full, and I'll put it on the board for you, because it is both rich and beautiful, and it will be essential to the rest of our discussion about morality. So I quote, "Now the object of the will, that is, of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal truth. Hence, it is evident that nothing can satisfy man's will save the universal good. This is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone, because every creature has goodness by participation. Wherefore God alone can satisfy the will of man, according to the words of Psalm 102, verse 5, who satisfies thy desires with good things. Therefore, God alone constitutes man's happiness. God alone constitutes human happiness. So what does this mean? Basically, our ultimate happiness, the capital G goal of our lives, is quite simply God. He alone suffices. He alone satisfies our spiritual soul's capacities of intellect and will, and there is nothing beyond him to satisfy us. He is the one who brings us from non-activity into activity, from non-being into being. He alone is supreme, and we will only be truly happy if we find ourselves in permanent and stable communion with him, a communion which will never end. So, what does that mean for the moral life? If the moral life, under grace, is a search for this happiness, that is because the moral life has as its goal nothing less than our eternal life with God. What do we call that state of blessed communion with God? What do we call our supreme happiness? Salvation, heaven, redemption, paradise, you can pick your name, okay? But if you're in heaven with God, that is where you will find ultimate rest, okay? Where your intellect is utterly fulfilled and your will is irrevocably in love. And there's just nothing you can do about it, okay? And this is actually something that should give us all great hope, because I think sometimes there's some confusion about this, okay? When we read in the Bible that so-and-so saw God, right? It's very important to understand that that is using analogical language, because if you see God, if you enter into the beatific vision, right? You aren't coming back, my friend, right? Because you were completely done, okay? And then you grow ever more into God, right? I mean, you just dive into the endless ocean of substance that God is, right? But it is not possible at that point to sin. Why? What is sin? Sin is a falsely placed search for happiness. If you are utterly happy, you are not tempted anymore by anything. Impossible. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why, right? You cannot enter heaven unless you are free of the guilt of sin, of serious mortal sin, right? You can't enter heaven with any sin. This is why there's a place of purification, a state of purification, right? My goal, as I said this last week in homily, is aim high, purgatory. Okay, right? And I say that jokingly somewhat, right? Aim high heaven. But, right, if you make it to purgatory, you've just won, folks, right? You are done, right? Purgatory is going to be painful because we all have lots of stuff, right? Even if we've repented of our sins, God has to drag us kicking and screaming away from those things which keep us bound to this earth. He has to be the all in all, right? And I know, speaking only for myself, right? Having just gone to confession, even so, right? I mean, if I were to die right now, I hope I'd make it to purgatoire, right? But the point is, I know that I'm not ready for heaven. I don't think I am, because I know myself, and I know that there's lots of things in this world that my will is not totally purified from, meaning that we all have sin and the effects of sin that continue to grab us, right? I shouldn't say we all do, because I don't know if Mother Teresa did, okay? But the great saints, this is the amazing thing about the great saints. The great saints are sort of in purgatory now. I mean, by analogy, right? I mean, the great saints are being purified now of that which keeps them away from God. And maybe on their deathbed, the great saints don't really have much to do more. Maybe they just walk straight into heaven.
Yeah.
I fully plan for a good deal of purification to come. All right,
Or
I'm gonna give you,
apostolic pardon. if you're lucky.
yeah, but even the apostolic pardon, right? Do you all know what the apostolic pardon is? Okay, so the apostolic pardon is a plenary indulgence that priests can give as someone gets very close to death, and a plenary indulgence, of course, can free you from all temporal punishment due to sin according to the church. But like all things that the church gives, it depends on the ability of the individual to receive. Right? It's not magic. It's not magic, right? It's not like you've been horrible, get out of jail free card, right? No, right? It is the individual has to be disposed to receive the outpouring of grace as well. It is not just the outpouring of grace, but the disposition of the soul to receive. Okay, take a break. So next in Aquinas' schema, let's talk about the passions. Now, for most of us, the word passion has but one connotation in the mind, namely of something intensely felt and usually of a sensual nature. So we might speak of the passion, right, of star-crossed lovers, a definition that finds its culmination in Romeo and Juliet and goes no further. Right? And while that is certainly an aspect of what we mean by passion, Aquinas also means much more. So let's talk about the meaning of the word passion, where it comes from, and why understanding the etymology of the word is important for understanding the concept. Second, where these passions are found in human persons. And third, the types of passions and their significance for the moral life. So first, etymology. The word passion comes from two words in Latin and Greek. In the Latin component verb patior and its Greek cognate pathein, which both of these words mean to suffer, undergo, or endure. By the way, this is why we call the events of Good Friday, which won our salvation, our Lord's passion. Okay, it is what Christ suffered and what the passion that he underwent for the sake of our salvation. So these Latin and Greek verbs, patior and pathein, are also the roots of a number of English words as well. For instance, on the Latin side, patior is the root of the words passive and patient, as in a medical patient, but also as in waiting for something to happen, right? And on the Greek side, pathein is the root of the English word pathetic. All of these words, or pathos, well, that's Greek. But all of these words deal with enduring or suffering something, and usually in a passive way. Right? And so, by what is translated as the English word passion, in a sense, Aquinas means by this something that happens to us, something that we undergo, not necessarily something that we have active power over at the level of its origin in us. So this brings us to our second question. Where do the passions reside in us? Where's their place in the human soul? In his analysis of this matter, Aquinas cites the 8th century father of the church, St. John Damascene's definition, which is also helpful for us. So St. John Damascene, great father of the church, especially known for his influence on the iconoclastic debate of that period. So St. John Damascene wrote in support of holy icons, right? And he writes, and I quote, passion, oh, I had this as a quote, there we go. Passion is a movement of the sensitive appetite when we imagine good or evil. In other words, passion is a movement of the irrational soul when we think of good or evil. Now, what does that mean? And keep in mind, this is why knowing Aristotelian philosophy is so important for Catholic theology. Irrational soul. What also has irrational souls? Animals, okay? Human beings do too, right? We have the irrational capabilities of the soul as well, right? We have what the animals have, but we have more, okay? So, what the Damascene is getting at is that the passions are interior movements or reactions to good or evil that actually happen to us or that we can imagine. These interior movements are not primarily intellectual or rational at all. That is, instead of pertaining to our reason, they actually pertain to the sensitive part of us as something that we feel in response to external stimuli, whether real or imagined. And I imagine that we can all see how this is true, because when we in English feel something, or excuse me, when we feel something intensely, it is often the case that that feeling both precedes and accompanies our thinking about the feeling. So let me say that again. When we feel something intensely, right, when we have an emotional feeling, right, we also, that precedes our ability to think about it and accompanies it, right? And we can get our emotions out of step with our reason all the time. Otherwise, he would not have a job. No.
We're irrational, we're incapable of
Exactly.
being rational
Exactly.
for a short period.
Right. And so this is why the whole, I mean, what's amazing about the church's philosophical tradition in this regard is that much of, and forgive me if I'm wrong about this, but much of what modern psychology holds is deeply indebted to this.
Oh, yeah.
Profoundly indebted to this, right? And so there is sometimes this sense, not in Catholic psychologists at all, but rather in people who, sometimes I think that psychologists think that they're reinventing the wheel, right? And again, that's not a critique of all psychologists.
It's a soft science.
Right.
It really is.
But it's a very important one because it deals with the human person. So now, I think that this is actually a really important point, this question of feeling and thinking, because in our modern context, how often have you heard people use the expression "I feel" in English, when in fact they mean "I think"? Okay. I think we hear this all the time. I hear it all the time. And I imagine that if any of you are or have been parents of teenagers, it might have been the only thing you heard for a while, right? But of course, there is a difference between what we feel in response to things we experience and what we think about our feelings and the causes of our feelings, right? So for instance, if I should find myself the victim of a car accident that isn't my fault and that I survive, I'm going to feel all sorts of things, right? And of course, I might be injured physically, right? But I will also feel things emotionally. And these are things which at first pertain only to the irrational and sensitive animal capacities, and not to me necessarily when they happen as a rational thinking person, right? So I might feel anger, fear, exhilaration, joy in my survival, and so on. But these feelings or passions are just the raw data upon which my thinking intellect can reflect and my will can choose. In themselves, they are, in a sense, pre-rational. So the passions are pre-rational. And in fact, we share many of these passions with the higher animals, which, while not rational like us, also feel the things that happen to them, and often in a deep way. So, for example, my doggies, behold. Okay, so these are my two morons. This is Louie, and this is Rafe. And anyone who's owned a dog ever knows at the level of what we might call their emotional intelligence, their passions. Dogs can tell if their owners are sad and they can seek to comfort them. And if you yell at your dog, what happens? he or she will often feel scared and cower if they can tell that you're really mad, right? Or they'll just think you're funny, which is unfortunate. But, right, oftentimes they'll cower, right? And of course, animals higher than dogs on the scale of perfection appear to experience suffering in an even more profound way. And although we cannot prove the connection definitively, although I think we're probably going to be able to, because we can, like, put probes on their brain or something like this, right? But elephants cry, okay? And they cry in response, they have tear ducts that actually leak like ours, and elephants cry in response to tragic events. So if an elephant's child, what do you call an elephant's baby? A cub or whatever, cat, right? So if an elephant's cat dies, right, they cry. Okay, and killer whales too have been seen mourning their dead offspring to the extent of carrying their corpses for many days at a time. This happened recently with one orca carrying her dead calf for 17 days before she finally let it sink. And 17 days. That is mourning in the animal kingdom. Okay? Now, what does that have to do with us? Well, this shows us that for humans, while the passions can be acted upon by our spiritual capacities of intellect and will, the things that make us truly human and created to the image and likeness of God, they are also not the highest part of us. To a degree, we share the exact same passions with the rest of the animal kingdom. And so now we come to the third point, namely, what types of passions exist in the human person? What do we experience as passions, and why does this matter for the moral life? Aquinas separates passions into two main types, the concupiscible and the irascible passions. Concupiscible and irascible. And as Father Pincair's points out, the concupiscible passions deal with, and I quote, our desire for the good that we perceive or flight from evil. And the irascible passions deal with, quote, difficulties and obstacles that make it difficult to attain the good. Okay? And again, these are all sensitive reactions in response to external stimuli or internal stimuli and passion, right? Everyone knows this, you can be scared in a dream. That is pure imagination, right? And you can be absolutely terrified, okay? Now, Father Pincair shows, and by the way, dogs dream too, right? Profoundly. I love watching
The little paws.
they cry. Yeah, and they whimper, right? So stimuli can be something we imagine, even in the animal kingdom. Okay, now, Father Pincair shows that from these two overall groups of passions, Aquinas draws out 11 of them, and they are here. Okay, and this is a quote from Father Pincair. In the concupiscible appetite, we find three groups of opposing passions: love and hate, desire and flight, joy and sadness. And in the irascible appetite, we also find three kinds of passions: hope and despair, fear and boldness, and finally anger, which has no opposite, according to Aquinas. Anger has no opposite, according to Aquinas. Right? Now, someone I'm sure can dream up, again, Aquinas does not necessarily have to be right on anything, on everything, right? So maybe the modern, what would psychology say is the opposite of anger? Something to
Joy?
Joy? Maybe.
I'm sure there's some models, but yeah.
I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. What?
Being
Being calm. But is that the opposite of anger? Being calm? Because there are other things we could be hyper, and the opposite would be calm.
Same content.
Patience.
Right, but content also has an opposite, discontent, right? And it is not necessarily being discontented. I don't know.
Empathy. That's what I just looked up.
Not,
That could be.
it is a synonym of anger.
Does the-
Well, anyway,
Social
continue.
He might be right.
Anyway, something to think about. Again, Aquinas could be wrong on this one, okay?
We're making it.
Now, in a certain sense, these passions are pre-moral, okay, pre-rational and pre-moral. That's very important. Passions are pre-moral, okay? So I want you all to remember this and to teach it in and of themselves. The passions are pre-moral, okay? It's important, right? Because they are initially, not always, but initially, they are pre-rational and pre-voluntary. They precede our thinking and our willing, right? If I stub my toe, right, I'm going to have to rein in my passions. But initially, the hitting of the toe is going to make me very unhappy, right? Now, this is of great importance for our study of the virtues and vices, to which we will turn in just a moment. What do I mean by pre-moral? Well, it helps you. Think of the passions as being, in a sense, the same as the emotions, as those things that both precede and accompany our moral life. Precede and accompany our moral life. They are the raw data. The passions are the raw data about which we think and upon which we act, morally or immorally. But in and of themselves, they are simply data. Data about how we sensitively perceive external stimuli, whether real or imagined. Data, right? So the passions are data. Okay.
Father, real quick.
Yes.
Pre-moral is this PRE dash moral?
Yeah.
Not PRI like moral.
No.
Correct.
Yeah, before.
Yeah.
Before moral.
That's what I got.
Yeah, pre-dash moral. Okay. So now we move to the third part of this section, which is virtue and vice. What are virtue and vice? For Aquinas and the Catholic Church itself, both virtue and vice are called habita, Habita in Latin, which can loosely be translated in English as stable and deeply rooted habits. So as the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches, I quote, human virtues are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. They make possible ease, self-mastery, and joy in leading a morally good life. The virtuous man is he who freely practices the good. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at what a habit is and why these habits can be both good and bad, virtuous and vicious. In short, a habit is something that we do over and over again, which over time becomes rooted in our character and determines how we act and thus who we are. And there are 3 points about habits from Aristotle that Aquinas cites in his own analysis that I'd like to look at with you. First, Aristotle holds that a habit is a quality which it is difficult to change. Second, that it is a disposition whereby someone is disposed, well or ill, and finally third, by habits, we are directed well or ill in reference to the passions. So let's unpack what this means. First, are habits difficult to change?
Yes.
Yes. On this point, there can be no doubts. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? And what this means, of course, is that once people are set in their ways, good luck trying to change them. And this can be both good and bad, or even morally indifferent. So for instance, on a non-moral plane, one can acquire the habitual ability of bike riding through practice over time. Now, as anyone who knows me could attest, I personally haven't ridden a bike in quite some time. During my 4 years at my immediately previous assignment, it sat in our garage gathering dust as I continued to get more and more chubby. But if I were to get on that bike right this second, despite the fact that its wheels are very deflated, right? I have absolutely no trouble writing it, right? That habitual knowledge is stuck in me. I know how to ride a bike. Now, with respect to good and bad moral actions too, we can become rooted in a particular type of behavior. So for instance, the person who, by God's grace, has become habitually kind and gentle will not easily shift to being rude and insensitive. And likewise, the person who has developed bad habits will be similarly rooted in his or her bad behavior. Of course, it's true that change can always happen with and through God's grace and with hard work on the part of the individual trying to change, but it's really not easy. Right? Second, in Aristotle's list, what does it mean for these characters to be dispositions to good or bad things which develop into full-fledged habits over time? Well, once again, and as we all know, some habits are good, some are not so good. But just because someone does something good or bad on a one-off occasion does not mean that he or she has a habit of good or bad action, right? So if you're nice to a little old lady once, right, you're not a saint, right? And you might turn around and be a total jerk to another person, right? So it does not mean that just because you do one bad thing or one good thing, that you are therefore developed in an habitual act of goodness or evil, right? Rather, we have to repeat good or bad actions again and again over much time in order for the disposition to become habitual. As Aquinas puts it, and I quote, "A disposition becomes a habit, just as a boy becomes a man." It's a slow development over much time. And finally, third, for Aristotle, what does it mean that by these habits we are moved to good or bad behavior with regard to the passions? Let's take the passion of anger for an example. Anger is the passion that reacts to injustice in the world. That's what anger is. But we can be angry in a good way and angry in a bad way. So for instance, if I, as a man of reasonably average physical strength and height, see someone being beat up by the side of the street, it's actually my moral duty to become angry and to intervene in some way to stop the aggressor, even possibly at the risk of physical harm or death for myself, right? Now, it may be the case that I just get on the horn and call the police immediately, but it also may be the case that more is asked of you, right? Now, if you are a tiny little baby, right, who is 80 years old and sees exactly the same thing, your duty is different than mine, right? Now, if I have the correct habits of courage and justice rooted in my character, then my passion of anger will be directed appropriately, and I will be moved to act to help the person under attack. And in fact, it would be, if I didn't get angry, it would be sinful for me not to get angry. Okay? Anger, remember, is not bad or good in and of itself. It's the passion that reacts to injustice in the world. So if I fail to get angry, I'm committing a sin of omission, a failure to act when I ought to do so.
So maybe the opposite is fear or cowardice.
Maybe. But can you be angry in a sinful way? Of course, right? So who of us hasn't had to apologize for getting angry inappropriately at someone we love? Right? I don't. I definitely need to apologize for that. Right? And so it is the habits that direct our passions to correct behavior. The habits direct our passions. And that's how these things are related. Now, since habits can be good or bad, another way to put this is that we can develop habits of virtuous action and or habits of vicious action. Now, when these habits are in place, they make it easy for the person who has them to live in accord with them. So the habits are also just known as the virtues and the vices, and they impact both our freedom and our happiness. This is the point that is really important for seeing here, okay? We can develop the freedom to act excellently in accord with that which is truly good, or we can diminish our freedom to act well at all. Let's say that again. We can develop the freedom to act excellently in accord with that which is truly good, or we can diminish our freedom to act well at all. We can have our passions well ordered by the virtues, or we can let our passions run wild in ways that lead us into slavery, into bondage. It's really as simple as that. So let's take the vices or bad habits first. And in order to explain this, I'm afraid I'm going to need to make fun of myself a bit. So for those of you who have had any interaction with me outside of this class or have heard of this, you can corroborate the truth of it. So for better or for worse, I am completely addicted to coffee. Okay? Without my coffee in the morning, I'm simply not a person you want to be around. Okay? More than that, okay, over much time, I have trained myself to need caffeine on a physical level. If I don't have coffee by a certain time in the morning, I get a headache. I'm addicted to coffee. Now, of course, caffeine addiction is not the worst thing in the world. It's a socially acceptable addiction. But it is nonetheless true that I am less free because of my caffeine addiction. My slightly vicious habit of coffee consumption on the grand scale, right? I remember I went camping with a bunch of friends when I was like 22. Right? I went camping with this big group of people and I thought, I hate camping. Okay, so I was doing this out of a desire to be, just friendly. Okay, we're all going camping. Oh, yeah, us. So the very first thing that I did in preparation for this trip is I thought, I am not going to be able to survive without coffee. So I went out and bought a camping strength, like some sort of plexiglass French press, which I lugged with me the whole time. It's great. I don't know what happened to this thing. But it was great, right? Now, could I break my habit of coffee consumption? Absolutely, right? It's not that hard of an addiction to break. I've done it before, but you know what? I just don't want to at the end of the day. Even though my freedom is slightly lessened by it, right? It would require me to act in a way that is exactly opposed to my habitual need for caffeine. And while it is certainly possible for me to establish the contrary virtue, right? It would mean a little bit of work for me, sort of a Lenten penance for others.
Ooh, Lent. Don't think about it.
No, but you see, the problem is, again, it would be a penance for others.
For others. I don't remember that. That's a great excuse.
So, is it a penance for me? Yes. Is it more of a penance for you? Yes. So,
Yeah, hope we don't have the class.
right. No, you see, evenings are fine. I'm well caffeinated by this point. All right. So, what about virtue? Right. Well, similar to vice, virtue is also a stable habit which becomes deeply rooted within us through practice over much time. Unlike vice, which limits our freedom, virtue, on the other hand, increases it. When we have a virtuous habit rooted within us, we become free to act in accord with good and to do so easily. As Father Pinckaers writes, I quote, "Virtue provides us with new strength by its action in us. It leads us to act and makes acting easier. It is a habitus, the power to act better and better, which is developed precisely in acting." In other words, when you have developed a particular virtue, say courage, you become free to act courageously with ease in a way that a person without courage simply isn't free to do so. Okay. Now, what types of virtue are there? For Aquinas and the Catholic tradition, the virtues are separated into two main categories: the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. Oh, I have this, I'm sorry, this should say theological. So moral is a typo there. Okay. The cardinal virtues are the moral virtues, okay? They are the central human moral virtues around which all of the other moral virtues are grouped. The theological, not moral, the theological virtues, on the other hand, are the roots of the cardinal moral virtues, but at the same time, they are also higher than the moral virtues in that they have the Trinity as their origin, motive, and object. What does that mean? We've already seen this with faith in our talk about the difference between the way faith and reason interact, okay? But when does God create faith in the human soul? Baptism.
Oh,
Bingo.
initiation.
Right. Okay. So God the Trinity creates them in the human soul. Faith, hope, and love, faith, hope, and charity. He creates them in our soul principally at the moment of baptism and does so directly. We cannot get them on our own steam, and they make it possible for us to live with God in heaven, to participate in the divine nature, as the Catechism puts it. Now, I'm going to go through these very, very briefly. Okay, prudence is the virtue disposing right reason to discern the true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. Justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Fortitude, these are all from the Catechism. Fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in pursuit of good. Temperance is the moral virtue that moderates the attraction of pleasures and provides balance in the use of created goods. So that's what the cardinal moral virtues are. Faith is the theological virtue by which we believe in God and believe all He has said and revealed to us, and that the Holy Church proposes for our belief because He is the truth itself. Hope is the theological virtue by which we desire the kingdom of heaven and eternal life as our happiness, placing our trust in Christ's promises and relying not on our own strength, but on the help of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Finally, charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for His own sake, and our neighbors ourselves for the love of God. So if you want to know what these are, they're in the Catechism, super easy to look them up, okay? And I just read them very quickly for you, okay? But I want to look more in detail now at how this works in terms of the moral virtues. So let's take the example of the virtue of temperance in the case of chastity. Excuse me. The man or woman who virtuously fulfills the commandments against adultery and coveting his or her neighbor's spouse is not a person who, through gritted teeth, barely manages to be chaste according to his or her own state in life. On the contrary, the man or woman who continuously fulfills these commandments in a stable and habitual manner has developed the virtue, the stable habit of temperance and chastity. Over much time, he or she has become free to be excellently chaste. He or she has developed joyous self-control when faced with temptations against purity. Excuse me, I'm gonna get some water. This is something. You thought so, but alas, no. He's back. I'm back. It was a quickie. Okay, so again, the person who has the virtue of chastity is able to order his or her passions and to do so freely, right? Unlike the person who hasn't developed this virtue and who is not free to resist the temptation easily, or who can only do so through much pain and effort, the virtuous person is simply not a slave to his or her desires. The chaste person is free to be chaste and can even be excellent in the way he or she lives this virtue. The lustful person, on the other hand, is a captive to vice and has no liberty to control him or herself. He or she would fall into the chasm of licentiousness when faced with the slightest lustful provocation. But the virtuously chaste man or woman is free indeed, free to be chaste, free to conquer the temptations to lust that present themselves in life without fail. And it is precisely that sort of moral life that God is calling us to live, okay? And this is hugely important, okay? By virtue, we do not mean continence, okay? So there is an earlier state on the road to virtue, which is called continence, which means this. If a person is white knuckling it to not sin in some way, right? And let's say by the grace of God, that person doesn't sin, right? That person has just made a step towards virtue, but he or she is not virtuous. He or she is continent, which means that he or she is fighting, and thank God he or she is fighting. But fighting means you ain't virtuous yet. Okay? If you're virtuous, it means that you can do so with ease, right? That's a huge difference, right? And we all may be in different states with different virtues and vices vis-a-vis this. We may have some people that we know who are just super brave all the time. They're like really courageous and it's easy for them, but they may struggle in another way, right? The goal is to become virtuous in all of the virtues, right? But we may be at different places. Some of us may be continent in certain areas and virtuous in others. Some of us might be just continent, right? And continence is good. Don't get me wrong, continence is great, right? But it's not where we want to be. We want to be free, right? You don't want to have to fight the same way. I'm not saying that a virtuous person doesn't have to fight, but a virtuous person can do so with ease, right? That's very different, right? And that is the type of moral life God is calling us to live. And if we live it, and if we work on our moral lives and choose His will over ours, we will find a radiantly new form of living. St. Gregory of Nyssa puts it beautifully and in complete accord with Aquinas' own understanding when he says, and I quote, "The goal of a virtuous life is to become like God." And the goal of a virtuous life is to become like God. Now,
So who said that? I'm sorry.
St. Gregory of Nyssa,
Oh, this one.
one of the Cappadocian fathers. So this might sound somewhat impossible, right? We might think, gosh, we're supposed to be virtuous and my goodness, I'm kind of continent. Good, right? If you're continent in an area and you're not virtuous yet, don't lose hope, right? Continue to practice. When you fall, ask God's mercy and pardon and try to pick up where you left off and move forward, right? All is not lost by one good action or one bad action, right? But we need to work constantly, right? What does the Bible tell us? With the grace of God, work out your salvation in fear and trembling, right? The Catholic churches and the Orthodox churches, for that matter, view of salvation is far more dangerous and fabulous than the Protestant view. Dangerous because you can lose it all. Right? God wants you to become a saint, but you can lose it, right? But joyous because it's not just something that we, Christ has done it for me, but I don't have to change. I'm kind of useless, but He's done it for me, right? Remember, we talked about this, I think, when I said that Luther said that we are dung covered by snow. What a hopeless view, right? It means that you stay dung, right? You just are dung. But Christ doesn't see it. The Father doesn't see it because Christ covers you with the snow, right? That means that you don't change. It means that you stay done, right? The Catholic view and the Orthodox view is totally different. It's get involved and by the grace of God become a saint, right? I mean, you can actually become good by the grace of God.
But there's a danger of going to the altar call and saying, Jesus saves me, and going back to life of sin, right?
Right, exactly. Well, and it's not a real conversion.
It's not a real conversion.
I mean, one of the things that is required, for instance, why does the church say that when we go to confession, we have to, make an act of contrition, right? Because confession isn't magic. Confession requires our participation, right? Repentance has to be real. Otherwise, the sacrament just does nothing, right? The sacraments work with our participation. They're not magic, right? So if you baptize someone whose entire will is against being baptized, that person's not baptized, right? Because if the person's saying, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this, you're dragging them to baptize them. God doesn't adopt people against their will, right? So sacraments aren't magic. Okay. Ooh, all right. Why don't we take a quick break and then I'm going to somehow race through this and we'll do what we get through. All right, quick break. God, right? Deacon wise, not wives of God. Wives of deacons. Not making you all into nuns. But anyhow, please. Wives of deacons. But what was I going to say? Oh yes. So if you ever want to show someone, I've discovered that this is the way to do it. How bad a liturgical song is, right? Just have them say the words without the music. Okay? Let us build the city of God. May our tears be turned into dancing. All right. Can someone illustrate for me what it looks like for a tear to turn into dancing? Okay. That line is word salad. Okay. That doesn't mean anything. F. Okay. Tears don't dance. Okay. For the Lord, our light and our love has turned the night into day. I mean, it's so bad. It's so bad. Anyway, you can do that with any liturgical song. Okay. Just say the words out loud and say, this poetry is awful. And therefore, there you go. The song is awful. I don't care how good the music is. And I'll just say one other thing about liturgical music and then I'll come back. The other day I was sitting outside at St. Vincent de Paul. We have a carillon that plays, hymns over the electronic bells, right? A lot of churches have some CD that it's playing, right? And I was listening to this and I was thinking,
Deutschland, Deutschland.
it is the Nazi national anthem. Right. I mean, so it is a wonderful tune by Haydn, which was co-opted during the Third Reich.
That I will be your servant.
No, it's who is she that stands triumphant? But it is also
Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt.
right?
Wow.
Which means Germany, Germany over all us in the world. I mean, I was listening to that and I came up to my pastor and said, makes you want to invade a small country. Alright, enough about the music, I'll go back to this. Okay. Alright.
Which is even more funny because Father Kevin was in the Marines. for
Yes,
20
exactly. That's 25 years. And he was actually quoting Franciscan who used to say the same thing. Anyway, funny. Right, okay. The next is, how does this relate to God's law? And I'm going to fly through this. So if this, I'm actually happy to send you this presentation if it helps, okay, because it's very dense. Right, we're going fast. All right. Let's come to the next part of Aquinas' structure of moral theology, namely the question of a law, both that of the Old Testament and that of the New. Because after all, if there's a moral law, there must be a moral law giver. So first we're going to look at the Old Law and the Ten Commandments, and second, the law of the New Testament. And this is related to what we've seen in the past couple of weeks, okay? So first, the Old Law. The Ten Commandments are also known as the Decalogue. In Greek, literally the 10 words are revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai in a direct way by God. Scripture refers to them as being written with the finger of God, in order to separate them in character from the commandments given by Moses under the light of divine inspiration. Remember, we saw this in our breakdown of how the medievals interpreted the law of old. There's the moral precepts, which are unchanging, directly revealed, as opposed to revealed by mediators, the ceremonial and judicial precepts, which pass away, okay? These 10 commandments were written by God on the tablets of stone delivered to Moses during the Sinai revelation, and they constitute a privileged part of the covenant God made with the Hebrews, that is, the Jews, right? The 10 commandments can be separated into two parts. First, commandments pertaining to our relationship with God, and second, commandments pertaining to our relationship with our neighbor. And so they are a drawing out of the double love commandment revealed in both the Old and New Testaments. That's how you can see this. The double love commandment is loving God and neighbor. That's loving God and neighbor, right? So that shows you that the law of the New Testament and the law of the Old Testament are actually exactly the same when it comes to the moral law. One just heightens the other. Okay, and what is the double love commandment? Jesus himself puts it this way. We are to love God above all things with all our hearts, souls, and minds, and we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, these are not meant to be competitive readings of the law. Loving neighbor should never compete with our love of God, but rather our love of God should include our love of neighbor. And so when we love God correctly, we find that our love of neighbor is properly ordered and correctly guided. Moreover, the 10 commandments are not something that we only know by divine revelation. Rather, the 10 commandments are something we can know by reason alone. So this all comes back to our very first class where we talked about the relationship between reason and faith, what reason can know by itself and how faith comes to elevate it, right? They are written on the human heart, known to us innately in the depths of our conscience, and they follow from our human nature. This understanding of the 10 commandments leads us to make distinctions in our understanding of divine law and human laws. So I'd like to look with you briefly at what Aquinas says about law, divine and human, in order to flesh out the distinctions that we need to make about the revelation of law in the Bible. What is law? Very long quote. Law is a rule and measure of acts, whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. For lex, law is derived from ligare, to bind, because it binds one to act. Now, the rule and measure of human acts is the reason, which is the first principle of human acts, as is evident from what has been stated above, since it belongs to the reason to direct to the end, which is the first principle in all matters of action, according to the philosopher. Who's that? Aristotle. Now, that which is the principle in any genus is the rule and measure of that genus. For instance, unity in the genus of numbers and the first movement in the genus of movements. Consequently, it follows the law is something pertaining to reason. Now, that's a mouthful. So, what does he mean? Basically, law is a rule or measure that binds us to act in accord with itself, and it pertains to human reason and our human nature. It pertains to human reason. Right? Law is not irrational. That means that it is also not contrary to our nature. We cannot, you see, be bound to that which is impossible to our nature, nor out of accord with right reason. Law is both rational and flows from our nature. So, for instance, it is rational to make a law that human beings should not commit murder. And this is binding for all people, everywhere, at all times, no matter what the circumstances. We all know that murder is wrong innately, and we see the reason behind it. However, it of course would be irrational to make a law that human beings should always use their wings to fly to work. Right? You could try to make that a law, right? But it wouldn't be a law at all. because it would be out of accord with right reason and also against our human nature. Aquinas wants to highlight here that universal moral norms are not something God needs to tell us by revelation in order for us to know them. Rather, we can discover the universal precepts of the moral law, by which he means the Ten Commandments, by reason alone. They are written into the human nature with which God has created us. However, these universal moral precepts also require specification, and they are often made more specific by merely human laws. So for instance, in order that people's lives be kept safe, which is a species of the commandment against murder and treating your neighbor as yourself, right? Different countries have developed different laws about safe driving. Here in the US, of course, we drive on the right side of the road, and if you were to disobey this law, you would put many people's lives at risk. In the United Kingdom, Australia, Ireland, India, most of the African, Asian countries, however, the situation is flipped, and people drive on the left side of the road. Of course, if you were to drive as an American in the UK, keeping to America's laws, because America, right, regarding the side of the road, right, you would put people's lives at risk, and you would transgress both the particular laws of Great Britain and the universal moral law regarding the preservation of life. Okay? You would break human and divine law. Okay? Now, both of these merely human laws, the way we drive, the way they drive, are legitimate prudential applications of the laws of safe driving, and both lead to the same goal, which is what? The preservation of life, right? Against the taking of human. And so merely human laws are specifications of the universally binding precepts of the moral law, ways of applying the Ten Commandments in the particular. And normally, we are obliged to obey these merely human laws as the prudential human means of obeying universal moral precepts. Okay? Where this gets interesting, of course, is when apparently legitimate human laws break the universal moral laws. In that case, it can be true that human laws cease to be real laws at all. And one is not only not obliged to obey them, one can also be obliged to break them. So, back to our Nazi friends, right?
Deutschland.
This is horrible, right? And I forgive me for making a joke about it, but I am, again, half Jew, so I say that with the full realization. So it was illegal in Nazi Germany to protect Jews. That's sick, right? And it was entirely legal to kill them. That is one of the most horrifying things that has happened, but it was legal, right? So morally speaking, the option for upright Germans during this horrible period was difficult but clear. If one had wanted to obey the universal moral law, one would have been obliged and quite justified in doing so to break the Nazi laws. And in doing so, one would have fulfilled the universal moral law, right? So if you didn't obey the Nazis, that was a good thing to do, right? Because the Nazis were committing horrendous crimes, which were completely legal, right? That's disgusting, but it's a fact. Another example can be seen in that in the southern United States, up until the latter half of the 20th century, there used to be so-called laws, anti-miscegenation laws, I always say that wrong, but anyway, against the marriages of blacks and whites. These marriages were illegal in the eyes of the state. Illegal. That's disgusting, right? And by the way, right, this was not only an unjust law that one would have been free to disobey, one would have also been obligated at times to disobey it. And the remarkable thing is that heroic people did obey both the Nazis in Germany and the racists in the southern US. We celebrate it today. for their fidelity to the universal moral law. And just because this is on Zoom, we're very careful here, right? Forgive my joke about Deutschland über alles, okay? I did not mean it when I said the Nazis are our friends. Obviously, I'm making a joke, not a very good one, okay? Just to be 100% clear to the internet folks who are not here, okay? Right. So the laws that are not in accord with the universal moral law, human laws that are not in accord with the universal moral law, can be laws that we are obliged to break. However, prudentially speaking, this is very difficult to ascertain at times, right? So it is not an easy answer. If you're given so for instance, there were many good Germans during the horrible Nazi period, many good Germans who were legitimately confused as to what to do. That is also because they didn't have all the information, right? But if you knew what the Nazis were doing, right, you were obliged to stand up. And unfortunately, many people didn't. Okay. So what we can see here is that the universal moral law revealed in the Ten Commandments is not arbitrary, but is in accord both with right reason and our human nature. But what does this mean? Basically, it means that the very condition of our human flourishing, our ultimate happiness, consists in obedience to the Ten Commandments. God knows what will make us flourish and happy. He created our human nature. If we refuse to obey the universal precepts of the moral law, we hurt ourselves and the human community around us. It is as simple as that. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that before we go on? The relationship between universal moral precepts and human law? Okay. So now let's talk about divine law. That is, the New Testament law. The Old Testament law is also divine. Okay? But let's talk about the New Testament law, the Sermon on the Mount and grace. So we've seen that the old law's Ten Commandments are not merely something revealed by God by special revelation, but also something universally rooted in our human nature, which lead to our human flourishing. What of the new law? And we're going to have to go through this as quickly as possible. I'm really racing to get done with this, so I realize that it's a lot of information, and I'll happily give this to you, okay? For Aquinas, a privileged location of the new law's congregation can be seen in what this image represents. What is this image? The Sermon on the Mount. And now let's see why it's important and what it tells us about happiness. First of all, just look at the name itself. The Sermon on the Mount. In the overall plan of the Bible, the fact that Jesus delivers his new law, the Sermon on the Mount, from a high place, a mountain, is deeply symbolic. Where else is a mountain involved in the giving of law? Sinai. Right, exactly. The giving of the old law on Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments. So the very setting should tell us something about what is being revealed here. Jesus is the new and ultimate Moses, the new and ultimate lawgiver. He is the one who fulfills the law of Moses, brings it unto its highest form. Now, while the Ten Commandments are properly God's law and not Moses' law as such, the Ten Commandments also form a part of the overall law of Moses, which Jesus both heightens and perfects. And what this means is that we need not read the Ten Commandments and the Sermon of the Mount in any way as competitors. One leads to the other. The Ten Commandments and the Sermon of the Mount are intrinsically connected. And in order to see this, what's the other name we use for the Sermon on the Mount? Yeah, the Beatitudes. Let's go back to the beginning of this lecture and to your questions, sir. All right. So we discussed earlier that the Latin word for our ultimate happiness is beatitudo. This tells us something profound about how we view the law of God, both of the Old and New Testaments. What do we read in the Beatitudes? And how do the Beatitudes complete and perfect the law of God? Let's look at them together briefly. When he saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came. He began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will become called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great. Thus they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Notice, the word by which our Lord begins each of these precepts is in Latin. The word for blessed is beatus. And what's another way to put that in Latin? How about happy? Okay. So when joined with the 10 Commandments of God in the Old Law, the Beatitudes give us our ultimate roadmap to happiness. The law, both that of the Old and New Testaments, is the way we reach beatitudo. God's law leads to his kingdom. Okay. So what of grace, right? We've talked a lot about law, but it is impossible to fulfill the law without grace. So what about grace? For Aquinas and the Catholic tradition, the principal novelty of the new law, that which makes it different than the old law in and of itself, is that the old law tells you what you're supposed to do, but doesn't in itself give you the grace to carry it out. So in a certain way, as Paul puts it, and in paraphrase, right? The old law puts us into a catch-22. We have to obey it, but we can't do so on our own. And that is not a good place to be, right? So, but with the coming of Christ and with his paschal mystery, his passion, death, and glorious resurrection, a new time begins in salvation history, and his grace floods the universe. Now we not only know the law of God, but we also have the necessary gift by which to carry it out, namely grace. And so God's grace, both the sanctifying grace of God given to us in baptism, and every time we repent in the sacrament of confession, as well as the actual graces given to us by God as he leads our lives back to him, are the necessary condition for our fulfillment of the old law and the new. Without grace, we cannot fulfill the law, but with grace, we most certainly can.
So the old law was salvific, as we learned, but
Well, was it the law itself that was salvific, or was it the one to whom the law?
right, exactly. Well, yeah, because Abraham saw Christ,
Right, so the law in itself,
but there was no grace
there was no grace in the law itself.
in the law itself.
Okay, so this is the fundamental difference between the way old law sacraments and new law sacraments function. The old law sacraments do not cause grace, right? They are modes for the profession of saving faith, which gives grace.
Okay.
Right? So this is a fundamental distinction. When someone is baptized, grace is given. When someone was circumcised, it was dependent upon their faith, implicit or explicit, giving them the grace. Now, baptism also requires faith professed, but it functions in and of itself. So it's the act function, unless someone rejects it. I do not want to be baptized. You're baptizing me against my will. That's a different question, right? But our sacraments function, the term, oh, I can't remember the word, ex opere operato. We're going to go into this next week because I think I'm going to do sacraments last because it's the way we get to heaven. Right? So our sacraments function ex opere operato, which means from the work worked, or by the very fact that they're done. So there's nothing that, the only way that a sacrament is derailed is by our unwillingness to participate in it, right? So again, if a candidate for ordination kneels down So you're about to be ordained as a deacon, you kneel down before the bishop, and he's about to put his hands on your head, and you look at him in the eye and you think, save me, oh God, this is not what I want, right? And if you, at that moment, intend against being ordained, you will not be ordained. Requires his intention to ordain you, your intention to receive it, right? So if you were to be against it, I do not want this, I'm not accepting this, this is a sham, right? If you were to come to the bishop after that and say, Bishop, this is what I chose at that moment. I'm not a canon lawyer, but I believe that that would be an invalidating clause, right? Because you're against it, and you don't want it, right? But otherwise it works, right? So whereas the sacraments of the old law were much more like unto, we could say, a Catholic sacramental, something that could dispose you to grace,
That makes sense.
but doesn't give it, right? Disposes you to the power of God, right? Good metaphor, like holy water, right? Holy water doesn't give you grace, but it can render your soul more apt for the reception of grace. Does that make sense?
Perfect metaphor.
Okay. So, okay, good. All right, so now we try to wrap up with answering the question posed at the very beginning. Jesus, happiness, etc. So, the search for authentic morality, or authentic freedom, morality, virtue, and happiness. Now, with this understanding of the law, both of the Old and New Testaments, I'd like to speak about how this relates to our human flourishing. So first, we're going to look at two opposing views of freedom and their relationship to virtue. And second, why this vision of morality is compelling for what John Paul II referred to as the new evangelization. Right? By the way, if you don't know what new evangelization means, right, it gets all sorts of traction these days, right? It has for 20 years, right? But it basically just means the evangelization of already evangelized places. So the re-evangelization of Christian places that have fallen away, like Europe, right? Like all of Europe, right? Okay. So, firstly, two different views of freedom. This comes directly from Survey from Cares. The freedom of indifference and freedom for excellence. So for those of you who have or had kids, how often have you heard the following creed occur from your little ones after telling them to do something good for themselves? I don't want to. You can't make me. Or my favorite, the nuclear option. You hate me. Now, I remember all too well being a child and teenager myself, and while I'm sorry to admit it, I too was often rather disobedient to my parents. They knew what was best for me, of course, but I was too proud, and I thought wrongly, too free to admit it and to submit to their guidance. But of course, this dynamic doesn't only apply to children and teenagers. Take one look at the history of human failures and you will see one dynamic clearly present. In our false understanding of authentic freedom, in our capricious, willful autonomy, we frequently choose lesser goods, and even that which is truly harmful for us. And in the end, we are just shocked when we find ourselves captive to vice. We make the terrible mistake of using our freedom indifferently, choosing poorly the things we desire over our better knowledge of truly good, and instead of becoming freer in the process, in the end we become slaves. He chose poorly, and then your head explodes and all sorts of things happen. You melt. Oh yes, yes. I was trying to remember. Oh yes, it's melted. Yes.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, we can call this view the Raiders of Lost Ark. No, we can call it the freedom of indifference. Freedom of indifference. And it has much of the world in its grip. But the vision of the Bible, of Aquinas, and of the Catholic Church is really different. So I would like to contrast that false view of freedom, the freedom that says, I can do whatever I want for my happiness, and how dare you think that you know better than I do, with the view of freedom that we promote as Catholics. So while it is true, we are ultimately all free to choose things that will not contribute to our social, right? But the true liberty that we all actually long for is the freedom to be able to be excellent. The freedom to become authentically virtuous, to perform good actions with ease. So I'd like to propose an analogy for this. How many of you like watching the Olympics? Okay, I love the Olympics. I'm a terrible, terrible athlete, one of the worst athletes in the history of the world. And I love the Olympics. But when I watch the greatest snowboarders in the world, for instance, the Winter Olympics, doing numerous backflips off a high jump, and then landing safely, I am in awe. If I were to find myself sliding down a mountain with my feet trapped in fiberglass, okay, I can tell you that the thought going through my mind would not be one of exhilaration, but rather one of sheer and repentant terror. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for ever having offended you. But actually, probably something far less pious than that. Okay? Right? Why? Because I'm not free to do as they do. I do not have the liberty of being an expert snowboarder. Even if I really want to, at this point in my life, that door is absolutely closed, okay? But for this 21-year-old American gold medalist, Red Gerard, the freedom to be an expert snowboarder is very real. And it's all based on the good snowboarding choices that he has made. During his young life, he has practiced snowboarding over and over. He has followed the rules or laws of snowboarding, and over time and with much effort, he has become one of the world's best. Now, he has authentic freedom and liberty in snowboarding. And that is precisely because of his obedience to the laws of snowboarding. He has developed the virtue he needs to innovate, improvise, and sail through the air upside down with grace and ease. He has a freedom for excellence that I will never have. And it's all because he has obeyed the laws of snowboarding to the point that they are now second nature habits for him, as much a part of his abilities as walking, right? And of course, freedom for excellence does not just apply to snowboarding. The revelation of the 10 Commandments highlights this. God gives us 10 moral laws which lead to authentic human flourishing, to the freedom to become authentically virtuous people. We are to obey these commandments not simply out of a begrudging and childish slavery to rules, but rather because when we fulfill these precepts habitually, we become truly free in each area of virtue to which the commandments pertain. One of the easiest ways to see this, of course, is to look at what disobedience to the 10 Commandments and the Beatitudes leads to. I challenge you to find me a single example of any normal man or woman, not a wacko, right, who on his or her deathbed says, you know what, I really wish I had been more of an adulterer in life, or I wish I had stolen more, or I wish that I could have been really mean and disrespectful to my parents. No, on the contrary, when we reflect on the areas of life in which we have failed miserably, we realize that our happiness in this life and in the next is predicated in no small part on our obedience to God's law in grace or our failure to do so. Obedience to God's law in the state of grace, far from leading us to bondage to a will other than our own, makes us truly free and leads to our enduring happiness. And it really is also a great consolation to know that despite our many past mistakes and our own human limitations, with God's help, literally anything in the world life is possible. Anything, right? You are not dung covered by snow. You are potential saints, right? And I think that a lot of times we in the Catholic Church miss this. We don't think of ourselves this way. I think that if you did a poll, if you said you're a potential saint, you'd be like, "Whoa, it's a little heavy," right? Look, there are only two options, right? You're either a saint in heaven or you're a sinner in hell. There isn't a third way, right? So you either have 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot in hell, or you have 1 foot in hell and 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on the earth, or 1 foot in hell. Right? Léon Blois, who's a great Catholic philosopher, said there is only one sadness, not to become a saint. Only one sadness. Right? Everything else, right? In God's eternity, which we hope to enter, right? In our human nature, we hope to be with God, right? For all eternity. When you are older than the moon, the sun, and the stars, looking back on your life, you will not think, man, I really did the 401k, just really. And when you are older than the sun, moon, and the stars, the 401k will pale, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing again, but it'll pale in comparison to whether or not you were virtuous. And it can be part of your road to virtue, don't get me wrong, okay? Financial well-being and all that can be part of a virtuous life. But it can also be an idol. And I'm just using that as one example, right? So there are all sorts of things that can lead us closer to God or away from Him. And in the end, what matters? Becoming a saint. So remember how I began this lecture by talking about how God is our ultimate happiness and how happiness is our ultimate goal in life. Remember how we discussed how the moral life is a search for happiness and therefore a search for God. And also how we grow in union with God through moral lives in the state of grace. Well, perhaps the easiest way to put this is quite simple. God's law makes us happy. Far from being moral commands that fetter us to some sort of legalistic subjugation, God's law, the 10 commandments of the old law and the Beatitudes of the new, are life-giving, and they rejoice the human heart. They bring us joy in their accomplishment here on earth. They lead to our ultimate beatitudo, our supreme happiness in the kingdom of heaven. And the only way we can obey that law is by the grace of Jesus. Okay, so without God's saving death in the human nature of Christ on the cross, the outpouring of grace throughout the universe, following the law of God is just not possible. Okay, so finally, I just want to say a brief word about why this is compelling for new evangelization. I would like to suggest that if we have the correct version of the moral life in our minds, and if we strive to fulfill it and proclaim it in a compelling way, we can actually preach the gospel through our lives in a way that people cannot fail to notice. We can show people how the Christian life is the best way to fulfill the happiness of our human nature. So, are we presently greedy with our time or our money? Become ridiculously generous. And guess what? People will notice, and they will wonder why we've changed. Are we presently promiscuous or lustful? Well, become chaste pure as the driven snow. And guess what? People will notice, and they'll ask about the reason for our transformation. Are we presently judgmental or imperious? Become gentle, become kind. People will notice and they will love the change in us. And then, when they ask us, we have an open door. Then we drive the Jesus truck through that door. So, right, we don't lead with the Jesus truck. Okay, remember what Aquinas says, we have to take down obstacles first, right? Protestant polemics, Protestant preaching often doesn't work, right? Or it doesn't lead to deep and profound change in people who are against it, right? Because it doesn't respect human nature, in my opinion, human freedom. We need to talk to people where they are before we, just become one of those people with fish. Or I mean, you see the cars. I used to have one. I had the Jesus fish. Some little Filipino lady, when I converted when I was 16, gave me an I Heart Jesus sticker. It was on my car. Okay, so I was one of them. Okay. But I don't think it works for our postmodern age. Okay. So if you remember only one thing from this class on morality, remember the following. The Gospels tell us, and I quote, Jesus did not need anyone to testify about human nature. He himself understood it well. So, our sovereign God is the author of our humanity. And in Jesus Christ, he even shares it. He knows what we need to be active. His moral law, which we can accomplish through the power of his grace, is the means to get us there. And so if we should find ourselves tempted in any way that is contrary to the moral law, when we desire to choose our will over God's, remember, he knows your nature better than you do. He created it, he knows your needs, and it is only in obedience to his way that we will find eternal happiness and authentic freedom. As St. Paul puts it, for freedom, Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Here's my joke.
Stacy's half Jewish also, and she said it was okay.
I'm sorry.
Stacy is half Jewish also, and she said it was okay. So that makes a full Jew.
Yes, I'm good. There's one of us.
Shall we pray?
Yes, we need to pray. Thank you.
Blessing.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
God bless you.